The night the city lights blurred against the glass, I realized silence could be sharper than any blade. Ethan tossed the divorce papers across the marble counter of our Manhattan penthouse, his Rolex glinting under the chandelier. He looked victorious, almost smug the way men do when they think they've already won. "You'll be fine, Ava," he said lightly. "I'll make sure you're taken care of." His voice was soft, rehearsed, the tone of a man closing a deal, not ending a marriage. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just smiled, the kind of smile that made him uncomfortable for the first time in years. For 5 years I'd known. The secret messages, the business trips that didn't exist, the perfume that wasn't mine. And for 5 years, I'd played my part, the quiet wife, the background figure in every success story he told. While he built his empire on arrogance, I was building something else, invisible, patient, and far more powerful. When I finally placed my hand on the cold papers, I whispered, "Ethan, the person leaving this marriage empty-handed isn't me." He froze, confusion flickering in his eyes. Because what he didn't know, what he could never imagine, was that I had already taken control of every vein that kept his $2 billion empire alive. Tomorrow, he would walk into a boardroom thinking he still owned the world. By sunset, that world would no longer belong to him. The first time I met Ethan was in Austin, beneath a sky streaked with orange and violet. He was charming in a careless way, the kind of man who made every word sound like a promise. Back then, we were both nobodies. He sold small commercial properties for a struggling firm, and I was an urban data analyst mapping pedestrian traffic for the city. We ate ramen on paper plates, split rent on a one-bedroom apartment with flickering lights, and believed success was just a matter of will. When he proposed with a ring that cost less than our monthly grocery bill, I said yes without hesitation. Love, I thought, would be enough. For a while, it was. We spent weekends driving out to hill country, dreaming about building something that would last, not just a business but a legacy. Ethan worked until midnight drafting development plans. I helped him refine his proposals, running numbers, fixing presentations. When his first big deal landed, a redevelopment project in Houston, he hugged me so tight I could feel his heartbeat pounding like victory drums. We were a team, or so I believed. But money changes people in slow, almost invisible ways. The suits became sharper, the wine more expensive, the phone always buzzing. Our late-night talks turned into one-word exchanges. The man who used to wake me up with coffee now woke me with the sound of a closing door. He started traveling Seattle, Chicago, Miami, always business. I tried to ignore the way he stopped calling me Aves, the nickname that once made me smile. On our 5th anniversary, he claimed he couldn't make dinner because of a last-minute client meeting in Seattle. Something in his tone, rehearsed, detached, made me check the travel tracker linked to our shared credit card. The boarding pass said Miami. And then came the photo sent by a friend without context, Ethan at a rooftop bar, his hand brushing the back of a woman in a red dress. Her name was Sienna Brooks, his new executive assistant. I remember staring at the picture until the city lights outside blurred into tears. That night, I didn't scream. I didn't confront him. I sat at the dining table, surrounded by spreadsheets and loan documents I'd been reviewing for his company, and something inside me shifted. My father once told me, "Revenge is a game for amateurs. Control is for professionals." My father, Walter Reed, had spent 30 years on Wall Street, orchestrating billion-dollar mergers, predicting collapses before they made the news. I'd never understood his obsession with leverage until that moment. The next morning, I packed a small bag and drove 3 hours to his estate in Connecticut. He opened the door, took one look at my face, and said nothing. We sat by the fireplace in silence for a long time before he finally spoke. "He's cheating." It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Then don't cry," he said, handing me a glass of scotch. "Study him. Make him your case study. You can't destroy a man like that by emotion. You have to make him collapse under the weight of his own arrogance." That sentence became my blueprint. Over the next months, I learned everything he'd never expected me to understand: capital structures, supply chain dependencies, credit covenants. I created a family office under my maiden name, Northbridge Holdings, disguised as a small private investment group. Through it, I began quietly buying shares in companies that serviced coal development, construction suppliers, logistics providers, even the regional bank handling their loans. Each purchase was tiny and visible on the surface, but together they formed an intricate web of influence. Ethan thought I was distracted by charity galas and social events. He'd smile indulgently, telling friends, "Ava finally has a hobby." I'd smile back, letting him believe it. Meanwhile, I was collecting data contracts, transactions, timelines, everything I'd need when the moment came. Every betrayal left a paper trail. Every lie could be measured in numbers. Still, there were nights when I questioned myself. Was I turning into someone like him, cold, manipulative, obsessed with power? I'd wake up before dawn, staring at the city skyline, remembering the girl who once believed in love over money. But then I'd think of the way he looked at me, that smirk of superiority, that quiet assumption that I'd never fight back and the doubt would burn away. By the time the 5th year arrived, I was ready. Ethan's empire had grown, yes, but its veins were mine, the suppliers, the lenders, the logistics, all under my quiet control. I didn't need to take his fortune. I already owned the machinery that sustained it. He just didn't know it yet. When he walked out of our bedroom one last time, briefcase in hand, he paused by the door. "You'll thank me someday," he said. I smiled faintly, staring at the faint reflection of the city in the glass behind him. I already did. The day after I left Connecticut, I woke up before dawn to the sound of the city coming alive, taxis honking, delivery trucks groaning, footsteps echoing through the hallway. But something inside me had shifted. For years, I had been reacting to Ethan's world. Now, I was about to build one of my own. My father's words replayed in my mind like a mantra. Don't fight power, redirect it. He taught me that the most dangerous weapon wasn't wealth, it was knowledge. Power collapses when you understand its structure better than the person who holds it. So, I started studying the architecture of Ethan's empire. Coal Development wasn't just a company, it was a web of subsidiaries, shell LLCs, and partnerships spread across states. It thrived on leveraged construction loans, deferred payments, silent investors who only cared about quarterly returns. Every success story Ethan told on magazine covers was built on invisible scaffolding, lenders, suppliers, brokers. And those, I realized, were the veins that kept his empire breathing. Through Northbridge Holdings, the investment office my father helped me set up, I began to buy small, unnoticeable stakes in those veins. 5% here, 7% there, just enough to get visibility into board meetings, voting rights, supply chain data. My name never appeared. The paperwork went through a Delaware trust, layered under a family foundation that traced back to my maiden name, Reed. To the world, I was still the quiet wife of a mogul. In truth, I was becoming the architect of his undoing. I started with Steelbridge Metals, one of his main suppliers. They handled steel shipments for most of his urban projects. When their CEO met me, he didn't even realize I was Ethan's wife. I came as A. Reed, representing a small fund focused on infrastructure innovation. Within 6 months, Northbridge held enough shares to influence vendor credit terms. Then came Hudson Logistics, the company controlling all of Coal's construction materials transport routes. By the time Ethan signed their next contract, I already sat on the advisory board under a different name. While he flaunted success at charity galas and weekend yacht parties, I spent my nights on calls with accountants and legal advisors, learning about covenants, liens, and subrogation rights. My notebooks filled with arrows, percentages, and diagrams, the veins of his empire drawn like a map of the human body. Every connection mattered. Every pressure point had to be prepared. But it wasn't only about money, it was psychological warfare too. I let Ethan believe I had given up, that I had accepted my place as the quiet background figure. I started dressing softer, speaking less in meetings, pretending to be impressed when he explained things I'd long understood. He mistook restraint for ignorance. That was my greatest weapon. There were moments when guilt clawed at me. When I saw him sleeping beside me, his breathing calm and unguarded, I wondered if I was becoming a monster. Was I truly different from him? But then I'd remember the photo in Miami, his hand tracing another woman's spine, his lips forming lies I used to believe. That image burned the guilt away. One evening, while Ethan was away on business, my father called. "You're moving fast," he said. His tone was proud, but wary. "Just remember, timing is everything. Don't pull the trigger too soon." "I'm not going to," I said. "I just want to make sure he can't destroy what I've built." He chuckled softly. then make sure what you're building doesn't destroy you first. After that call, I started to understand what he meant. The more control I gained, the colder I became. My life turned into transactions, acquisitions, and forecasts. I stopped laughing, stopped painting, stopped reading. Everything became a chessboard. Then one morning, while reviewing a supplier contract, I saw Ethan's signature on a new entity, Coal Innovation Partners, LLC. The address was in Florida. The purpose line said, Strategic Marketing Consultancy. It was one of those fake fronts he and Sienna had set up to siphon money. I could have exposed it right then. Instead, I made a different choice. I let it live. Because a trap only works if the prey believes it's safe. I began documenting everything, every invoice, every wire transfer, every fake consulting fee. Using secure cloud backups, time-stamped messages, and third-party verification, I created what lawyers call a forensic paper trail. Evidence so clean it would stand in any courtroom. At the same time, Northbridge expanded further. I took small equity positions in Atlantic First Bank, one of Coal Development's main creditors. With those shares came access to board meeting minutes and insight into Ethan's credit exposure. Slowly, the puzzle fit together: his over-leveraged projects, delayed payments, bloated payroll. I knew exactly how fragile his empire had become. But I didn't want to ruin him overnight. I wanted the collapse to feel natural, like gravity doing its work. The true art of revenge isn't destruction, it's precision. As months turned into years, I watched him fall deeper into arrogance. He flaunted his success in business magazines, appeared on TV panels about urban resilience, spoke about innovation and family values. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. He had no idea that every speech he gave, every contract he signed, was already tethered to me. And, through it all, I remained invisible, the woman who smiled beside him in photographs, who applauded when others called him a visionary. No one ever looked twice at me. That was the beauty of being underestimated. The night before everything began to unravel, I stood on the balcony of our penthouse, looking down at the endless grid of lights. Each one felt like a secret I'd buried, waiting to rise. Ethan was asleep, his phone buzzing with messages from Sienna. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. Because by then, I no longer cared about the affair. What I cared about was legacy, not his, but mine. And mine was about to begin. By the time spring arrived, the chessboard was nearly complete. Every move I'd made, every company I'd touched, had created invisible threads that converged at one single name: mine. But I wasn't after a headline or vengeance for betrayal anymore. What I wanted was control. True control. The kind that no judge, no lawyer, no unfaithful husband could ever take away again. Ethan's empire, Coal Development, had grown massive on paper but hollow at its core. Its lifeblood flowed through credit lines, suppliers, and logistics partners. I didn't need to own his company outright. I only needed to own its arteries. And through Northbridge Holdings, I quietly did. Steelbridge Metals, his primary supplier for steel and raw materials, became my first success. I had started with a 5% stake, small enough to avoid attention, but when the CEO retired and sold his remaining shares, Northbridge stepped in. With board voting rights came a say in the supplier contracts, and one subtle clause: net payment terms reduced from 90 to 30 days, changed everything. Suddenly, Ethan's projects needed faster cash flow. It was a small tightening, one he didn't notice yet, but it forced his company into constant motion. Then there was Hudson Logistics, the shipping and freight company handling materials from New Jersey ports to construction sites across the tri-state area. I bought into them through an intermediary fund and secured a quiet seat on their risk oversight board. There, I suggested safety audits and OSHA compliance checks that would conveniently cause delays at key project milestones. Again, all legal, all procedural, and all devastatingly effective. But the most strategic move was Atlantic First Bank. Through Northbridge's partnership with a pension fund, I acquired just enough influence to monitor Coal Development's credit covenant reviews. It wasn't control, it was surveillance. I could see when Ethan drew down on his revolving credit, when his debt ratios tightened, when his personal guarantees were triggered. I knew when he was stressed before he even did. Still, he strutted through our penthouse like a king. He'd take calls at midnight, boasting about owning the skyline. I'd pass him coffee in the mornings, listening to his plans, pretending to be impressed. The irony was almost poetic. He was telling me how he'd reshape the city, unaware I was reshaping his future. At night, I would return to my study once, our guest room now filled with binders, encrypted drives, and hand-drawn diagrams. Every page, every line was a record of his empire's anatomy. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate would have made it personal. This was business, cold, deliberate, mathematical. But sometimes, in the quiet between deals, I'd catch a glimpse of my reflection and barely recognize the woman staring back. The softness in my face had vanished, replaced by something sharper, resolute, maybe even ruthless. My father once said, "When you study predators too long, you start moving like one." I was beginning to understand that truth. Then came the night of the investor gala. Ethan was radiant under the ballroom lights, shaking hands, laughing too loudly. Sienna stood near the bar, wrapped in a black silk dress, watching him with that mixture of ambition and possession I once knew well. When Ethan spotted me, he introduced me to a group of financiers as my wife Ava, who prefers to stay out of the business talk. They laughed politely. I smiled, and so did he. But my smile held something he didn't recognize anymore. After the speeches, I slipped away to the balcony, staring at the skyline Ethan claimed he owned. My phone buzzed a secure message from my legal counsel. Transfer complete. Northbridge now holds controlling interest in Hudson Logistics via trust. I looked down at the city lights and whispered, "Checkmate." A few weeks later, I set the next domino in motion. Steelbridge adjusted its shipping schedule, citing market volatility. Hudson Logistics implemented a stricter delivery priority system. Clients with delayed payments dropped to the end of the queue. Atlantic First Bank, acting independently, requested updated cash flow statements to maintain compliance. Individually, these were routine business moves. Together, they were a slow bleed. Ethan noticed, of course. He'd slam his phone down after tense calls, pacing through the living room. "Idiots can't manage a supply chain," he muttered. "Everything's delayed. Costs are ballooning." "What will you do?" I asked softly, pretending to care. "I'll handle it," he said, with that same arrogance that once charmed me. "I always do." But his confidence wasn't real anymore. I could see the cracks in his voice, the unease behind his eyes. Nights grew later, phone calls longer, and whiskey glasses emptier. He didn't know that the chaos wasn't random, it was engineered. Still, I wasn't reckless. I moved with precision. Every decision had to be clean, traceable, lawful. I didn't want to ruin him through scandal. I wanted him to collapse through his own mismanagement, with me standing untouched, untouchable. It wasn't until one quiet Sunday morning that I realized the depth of what I'd done. Ethan was still asleep, his face peaceful for once. Sunlight crept across the sheets, and for a moment, I felt nothing. No joy, no triumph, no regret, just emptiness. Because somewhere between betrayal and strategy, I had lost the part of me that believed in love, or forgiveness, or even fairness. I walked to the window, staring down at Central Park, where couples strolled hand in hand. Life went on, oblivious to the war I was waging behind closed doors. I thought of the woman I used to be, the one who believed marriage was a partnership, not a transaction. She was gone. In her place stood someone who understood leverage, timing, and silence better than any boardroom veteran. But there was still one final step. Ownership wasn't enough. To end the game, I needed revelation, a moment when the truth would stand in front of Ethan like a mirror he couldn't look away from. So I waited. I let the markets tighten. I let him feel the pressure. And when he finally came home one night, jacket undone, eyes red with exhaustion, I knew the storm was close. He poured a drink, sat on the couch, and muttered, "Everything's slipping. I don't know what's happening." I watched him for a moment, then simply said, "Maybe you should rest." He looked up, suspicious, almost fearful, as if sensing something beneath my calm. But I just smiled, the same quiet smile I'd given him the night he threw divorce papers across the table. Because the truth was simple, I didn't need to fight him anymore. I already owned everything that kept him alive. And soon, he'd learn that lesson in the only place he still believed he was safe, inside his own company. The unraveling began quietly, not with a scandal, not with a fight, but with silence. The kind of silence that creeps into boardrooms and bedrooms alike, suffocating everything it touches. Ethan thought the storm was outside. Suppliers, banks, contractors. He never once looked inside his own walls, where the real corrosion had already begun. It started with a missed shipment. Steelbridge Metals delayed a key delivery to the Hudson project, citing compliance verification. Ethan's site managers panicked, but Steelbridge's representative was polite and firm. "Just a procedural check," they said. Ethan signed new terms, barely reading the clauses. Those terms gave me through Northbridge the ability to dictate fulfillment priorities. Then came Hudson Logistics. They flagged multiple invoices from coal development for inconsistencies in routing documentation. The delays rippled through the system like a virus. Trucks stood idle, workers clocked overtime, and subcontractors demanded penalties. Ethan's CFO begged him to step in. But Sienna, now his operations partner, assured him it was just a blip. "We'll push payments later," she said, scribbling on her tablet. "Cash flow will catch up." It didn't. I had designed it that way. Each time they tried to patch one hole, two more appeared. The tighter they held on, the faster the sand slipped through their fingers. And I wasn't doing it out of rage anymore. It was methodical, like watching an equation solve itself. The irony was that I didn't have to fabricate a single thing. The fraud Sienna helped him build years ago, fake consulting contracts, phantom vendors, offshore wire transfers, was real enough. All I did was illuminate it. I let them trap themselves in their own web, one email, one invoice at a time. My legal team, a group of quiet, meticulous minds, began compiling. We didn't steal. We documented. Every financial movement. Every disguised payout. Every asset shift into shell LLCs. I had hired forensic accountants trained in federal compliance. They called it building a clean case file. I called it patience. One night, while Ethan was on a call with his project managers, I sat across the room with my laptop open, listening to his tone, that sharp, cutting tone he used when he felt threatened. "Tell Steelbridge," he barked, "that we'll pull the contract if they don't deliver this week." I smiled faintly. He didn't know he was threatening me. When he hung up, I asked, "Rough day?" He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Suppliers are a nightmare. Nobody keeps their word anymore. Maybe the industry's just gone to hell. Or maybe," I said softly, "the wrong people are in charge." He frowned, sensing the edge in my words. But I just sipped my tea, calm as ever. A week later, the storm gained form. Atlantic First Bank issued a credit covenant review, a formal audit triggered when a borrower's liquidity ratios fall below a threshold. It was standard procedure, but timing is everything. Ethan didn't have the reserves. Not after months of mismanaged payouts to his shell companies. He called his CFO in fury. How did this happen? The answer, of course, was simple: arrogance. Ethan had built an empire on charm and shortcuts, and he believed the rules bent for him. But money doesn't care about charisma. It obeys math. Behind the scenes, I gave quiet instructions to Northbridge's counsel: cooperate fully with the bank, provide every document, every timeline, every compliance record. The narrative was clean: Northbridge is acting in the best interest of shareholders. On paper, I was simply a responsible investor protecting my capital. In reality, I was turning the tide of his entire career. And then, like clockwork, came the audit results. Fraudulent disbursements, conflicts of interest, undisclosed related party transactions, all neatly summarized in a 57-page report. The numbers didn't lie. They didn't need embellishment. The night Ethan received the preliminary findings, I found him standing by the window, shoulders hunched, glass of bourbon trembling in his hand. He didn't hear me enter. "Are you okay?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, almost in disbelief, "They think I've been funneling money through consulting firms. They're insane." "Are they?" I asked. His eyes darted toward me, sharp, defensive. "You think I'd risk everything for some tax technicality?" I didn't reply. The silence did the work for me. He turned away, muttering curses under his breath, as if anger could erase evidence. That night, after he fell asleep on the couch, I sat beside him and studied his face. The same man who once knelt in the rain outside our first apartment, begging me to believe in his dreams. The same man whose ambition once felt electric. Now he looked smaller, older, like the empire had aged him in reverse from god to ghost. I thought I'd feel satisfaction. Instead, I felt a strange melancholy. I had spent years preparing for this fall, but I hadn't prepared for how quiet it would be. No fireworks, no chaos, just inevitability. Still, I didn't stop. Because this wasn't the end yet, it was the setup. The more he panicked, the deeper he'd dig his hole. And I needed him to reach the bottom himself. In the following weeks, Ethan tried to fight back. He called emergency meetings, blamed suppliers, replaced his CFO, even threatened lawsuits. Sienna drafted memos trying to restore investor confidence, but whispers had already spread. The market smelled blood. Banks pulled back credit lines. Contractors demanded prepayments. Coal development, once a symbol of power, became a liability overnight. Meanwhile, I stayed invisible. I attended charity luncheons, smiled for photos, signed anonymous documents. People still saw me as the wife of Ethan Cole. I let them. The most powerful position is often the one no one pays attention to. Then came the email I'd been waiting for, a notice from the board's independent counsel. Request for extraordinary shareholder meeting, Coal Development Holdings. It was time. When I closed my laptop, I looked out over Manhattan again, remembering the night he first threw the divorce papers on the counter. The same skyline, the same silence, but everything was different now. Back then, I had nothing. Now, I owned everything that mattered. And the most poetic part? Ethan himself had signed every document that gave me that power. He'd handed me control, one careless signature at a time, never realizing the wife he underestimated had been the architect all along. In the distance, thunder rumbled over the Hudson. The air felt heavy, electric, like the city was holding its breath. Tomorrow, I would no longer need to hide. Tomorrow, I would walk into his world, not as his wife, not as his shadow, but as his reckoning. The morning of the shareholder meeting, the sky hung low and gray, as if New York itself was waiting for the curtain to rise. I watched the clouds crawl over the skyline from my window, the same skyline Ethan once swore he would own. Today, he would learn what ownership really meant. My reflection in the glass didn't look like me anymore. The soft-spoken wife from Austin was long gone. In her place stood a woman in a black tailored suit, hair pinned into a precise twist, expression calm but sharp, the armor of someone who had walked through fire and learned not to flinch. As I fastened the clasp on my pearl necklace, I remembered my father's words, "Control doesn't shout, Ava, it whispers and the world listens." By the time I arrived at the Midtown office, the atmosphere was brittle. Assistants moved quietly, eyes down. Ethan's name was still etched in silver on the glass wall, Coal Development Holdings. I traced it with my finger briefly, then walked past it without a glance back. Inside, the boardroom smelled of expensive coffee and fear. Ethan stood at the head of the table, his tie slightly loosened, eyes burning with that same mix of arrogance and desperation I'd come to recognize so well. He didn't see me enter at first. When he did, his lips curved into a thin, cold smile. "Ava," he said, voice laced with condescension, "I didn't realize you'd be here. This is business, not a charity brunch." I met his gaze without blinking. "It's both, actually," I said softly, "depending on who you ask." He frowned, but before he could respond, the general counsel announced, "The extraordinary shareholder meeting will now begin." For the next 10 minutes, Ethan performed his routine, the confident CEO speech, the rallying cry to weather temporary setbacks, the promise that coal development remains financially strong. He tried to charm, to deflect, to dominate the room the way he always had. But charm is powerless against math. When the CFO presented the latest financials, the numbers told a different story. Cash flow strained, debt covenants breached, project delays bleeding millions. And worse, discrepancies in vendor payments now under federal review. Ethan's tone faltered mid-sentence. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. That was my cue. I rose slowly. Chairs creaked as heads turned. The sound of my heels crossing the polished floor was louder than it should have been. Ethan tried to maintain composure, but I saw the panic flicker behind his eyes. "I'd like to address the board," I said calmly. He smirked. "You don't have standing here, Ava. This is a corporate matter." "That's precisely why I'm here," I replied, sliding a folder across the table. Northbridge Holdings, my firm, now holds controlling interest in Coal Development Holdings through its subsidiaries and investment trusts. For a moment, silence swallowed the room. You could hear the air conditioning hum. Then the general counsel cleared his throat. That's correct. As of last quarter's filings, Northbridge has consolidated voting rights exceeding 60% of shareholder equity. Ethan's expression froze. That's impossible. It's paperwork, I said evenly. You've always been careless with paperwork. He looked around the room for support, but the faces that once nodded to his every word now avoided his gaze. Fear moves faster than loyalty. You set me up, he hissed under his breath. No, I said, leaning closer. You set yourself up. I just learned how to read the fine print. The next hour unfolded like a slow dissection. The board reviewed documentation, every acquisition, every financial tie, every legal link between Northbridge and his supply network. My team had prepared it meticulously. Bulletproof, lawful, undeniable. Ethan tried to interrupt, to shout, to threaten lawsuits, but every outburst only made him smaller. The man who once commanded entire rooms now looked like a child caught stealing from his own till. When the motion to remove him as CEO was raised, no one objected. Even his allies stayed silent. It wasn't personal, it was survival. Businessmen always know when to abandon a sinking ship. The vote passed. Just like that, Ethan Cole, self-made mogul, visionary developer, was stripped of the title he'd built his identity on. He stood there, trembling with disbelief. You think this makes you powerful? He spat. You'll destroy everything we built. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time in years I felt a flicker of something human. Not love, not pity, recognition. He was what I could have become if I hadn't learned restraint. I'm not destroying it, I said quietly. I'm saving it from you. He stared at me, eyes wide, voice trembling. All this time, you knew. For 5 years, I said, and every day of those 5 years, I let you believe I was powerless. Because the truth, Ethan, is that men like you only understand power when it's silent. He collapsed into his chair, face pale, mouth slightly open. The room remained still. No one dared move. Finally, I gathered my folder and turned to leave. Effective immediately, I said, Coal Development will be restructured under new management. Northbridge Urban will assume operations. Transparency will be our foundation moving forward. As I reached the door, Ethan's voice cracked behind me. Ava, wait. I paused. He looked shattered, his bravado gone. You win, he whispered. Is that what you wanted? To humiliate me? I turned, my voice steady. No, Ethan. I wanted to make sure you could never humiliate anyone else. And then I left. Outside, the spring rain had started to fall, light at first, then steadier, washing the glass buildings clean. I stood under the awning, breathing in the damp air, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not triumph, not vengeance. Just release. As I watched the city blur through the rain, I realized this was what freedom looked like. Not loud, not grand, but quiet, like the pause between lightning and thunder. And somewhere in that silence, I could almost hear my father's voice again. Control doesn't shout, Ava, it whispers. He was right. Tomorrow, the headlines would talk about a power shift at Coal Development, about Northbridge's sudden rise. None of them would mention the years of quiet endurance, the betrayal that started it all, or the woman who rebuilt herself from the ruins. That was fine. I didn't need credit. I didn't need applause. All I needed was this moment standing in the rain, no longer the wife of a king, but the architect of her own empire. And for the first time in 5 years, I smiled not out of defiance, but out of peace. Because I had finally learned revenge wasn't victory. Survival was. The following morning, sunlight broke through the curtains like a verdict. For the first time in years, I didn't wake to the hum of Ethan's voice on the phone or the echo of his footsteps pacing across the marble floor. The penthouse was silent, too silent. And yet, that silence no longer scared me. It felt earned. It felt like the sound of a war finally over. I stood by the window overlooking Central Park. From up here, the world looked smaller, calmer. Joggers moved like clockwork below, taxis snaked through the streets. New York hadn't changed overnight, but I had. The woman who once flinched at her husband's anger, who waited by the phone for scraps of affection, was gone. The world would know me now, not as Mrs. Cole, but as Ava Reed, CEO of Northbridge Urban. I dressed carefully. Black suit, clean lines, no jewelry except my father's watch. It wasn't vanity, it was declaration. Today was my first official day leading the company that once belonged to him. When I arrived at the office, the same people who used to look past me now stood straighter. Some nodded, others whispered. Respect, I realized, wasn't about titles or power, it was about the way people looked at you when they knew you couldn't be broken. Inside the boardroom, reporters hovered like vultures. Flashbulbs burst as I entered. "Miss Reed," one shouted. "Was the takeover premeditated? Was this revenge against your ex-husband?" I smiled faintly, measuredly. "It was accountability," I said. "Coal development was built on vision but lacked integrity. Northbridge Urban will restore that balance." They scribbled furiously. I didn't elaborate. Truth didn't need justification. The rebranding ceremony was quiet, efficient. Workers replaced the old silver Coal Development Holdings letters on the glass facade with a new logo, Northbridge Urban, building the future, honestly. When the final bolt tightened, I felt something shift inside me. The ghosts of his name, his legacy, his betrayal, they all seemed to lift, carried away by the cold city wind. But rebuilding wasn't just about changing names, it was about redefining purpose. For months, I met with urban planners, environmental engineers, and social housing experts. We redirected millions towards sustainable architecture, solar infrastructure, affordable living spaces, green zones in working-class neighborhoods, projects Ethan had once dismissed as unprofitable. When I toured our first renovated site in Queens, a derelict factory transformed into eco-housing for veterans, I met an old man sitting on a bench in the courtyard. He was missing a leg, his hands trembling as he fed pigeons. "You the new owner?" he asked. "I'm the new caretaker," I said. He laughed softly. "Same thing. If you do it right." That sentence stayed with me for days. Caretaker. I liked the sound of it better than CEO. Maybe power was just another word for responsibility, the kind too many people abandon once they've won. Still, rebuilding an empire from its ashes came with ghosts. Ethan's name lingered in the media, in whispered conversations at industry events. Some said he'd left the country. Others claimed he was fighting legal battles in silence. I didn't check. I didn't need to. The part of me that once sought closure had already buried him. Yet one night, months later, a letter arrived. No sender listed, just my name typed neatly on a cream envelope. I almost threw it away, but something made me open it. Inside was a single page, his handwriting unmistakable. "Ava, you were always the smarter one. I see that now. I've lost everything, and maybe I deserve to. But part of me still believes we built something real once, before the lies, before the ambition. I hope you find peace in what's left of it. E**. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. I didn't cry. I didn't forgive him. But for the first time, I didn't hate him either. Because in a way, he had given me the most valuable lesson of my life. Power built on deceit always collapses. But power built on truth, on endurance, becomes untouchable. The next morning, I held a town hall meeting with every employee of the new company. The room buzzed with uncertainty. They expected a speech about profits, targets, strategy. Instead, I began with something else. When I was younger, I said, I thought love could save anything. Later, I thought power could. Now I know only discipline and honesty can. Those are the foundations we'll build on. If you work for Northbridge Urban, you work for a future that will outlive all of us. There was a moment of silence. Then, one by one, they began to clap. It wasn't thunderous or forced, it was steady, sincere. And that sound, that rhythm of hands meeting hands, felt like the first heartbeat of something alive. That evening, when the offices emptied and the lights dimmed, I walked alone through the corridors. My heels echoed softly against the marble floor. On one wall hung the new mission statement, printed in clean black letters. Integrity is architecture. I paused before it, tracing the words with my fingertips. For years, I had built walls around myself out of fear, anger, pride. But this wall was different. This one let the light through. Later, standing again at my window, I watched the city pulse below. Somewhere out there, Ethan was probably watching too, from some small apartment or distant shore, but that no longer mattered. I didn't build this to prove him wrong. I built it to prove myself right to the woman I'd been, the one who once mistook silence for weakness. The skyline shimmered with 1,000 small lights, and for the first time, I understood. Each one wasn't a monument to power, but to endurance. To people who refused to disappear, no matter how many times the world tried to erase them. As I turned off the light, I whispered to the empty room, "Here's to starting over, not from nothing but from truth." And in that moment, I finally felt what I'd been chasing all along. Not revenge. Not victory. Freedom. Autumn crept over New York like a quiet confession, gilding the skyline in amber light. Months had passed since the boardroom coup, since the day Ethan lost everything, and I walked out of the ashes with a calm that terrified even me. Yet the aftermath was not triumph. It was transition. And transition, I was learning, was its own kind of reckoning. Northbridge Urban was thriving. Investors called it a miracle, analysts called it a textbook turnaround, and the press called me the Iron Widow of Manhattan. I ignored the headlines, but every time I saw that phrase, something in me twisted because it wasn't power they admired. It was the myth of vengeance. And vengeance, though intoxicating, is never sustainable. Every morning I arrived at the office before sunrise. I liked the emptiness, the echo of my heels, the hum of the city below. It reminded me that rebuilding something meaningful required solitude. But some nights, long after the lights dimmed, I'd catch my reflection in the glass and wonder who I'd become. The woman who had spent 5 years plotting in silence didn't know how to stop calculating. My brain, trained to anticipate betrayal, still mapped every conversation like a chessboard. Then came the email that broke my rhythm, a name I hadn't seen in months, Ethan Cole. The subject line read simply, "Meeting request." For a long time I just stared at it. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. I could almost hear his voice in those 2 words, confident, composed, rehearsed. A man who'd lost the world but still clung to the illusion of dignity. When I finally read it, the message was brief. "Ava, I won't waste your time. I'm leaving the country next week. But before I do, I'd like to see you. No lawyers, no headlines. Just the truth. One last time. ***. I almost deleted it, but something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was closure. Or maybe, though I hated to admit it, part of me wanted to see the man who'd once promised me forever and ended up teaching me how to survive. We met 3 days later at a small cafe in Tribeca, the same one where we'd signed our first business loan years ago. When I arrived, Ethan was already there, sitting by the window, thinner than I remembered. The confidence was still in his posture, but his eyes had changed no arrogance, just fatigue. "Ava," he said quietly as I sat down. "You look untouchable." I smiled politely. "And you look human. That's an improvement." He laughed, but it came out broken. I guess I earned that. For a while, we didn't speak. The city moved outside like a movie we weren't part of anymore. Finally, he said, "You were right. About everything. About me. About how this would end." "I didn't want it to end," I said. "I wanted the truth, but you couldn't live with it." He looked down, tracing the rim of his cup. "I thought power made me free. Turns out it just made me blind." His voice cracked on that last word, and for a second, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with, the dreamer, not the tyrant, but that version of him had died long ago, buried under ambition and ego. He reached into his jacket and slid an envelope across the table. "These are the last documents I have. Ownerships, patents, designs, all of it. It's yours. I don't want ghosts haunting me where I'm going." "Where are you going?" I asked. "Lisbon," he said softly. "There's a small architecture firm there. They don't know who I am. I'll be drawing again, starting over." I nodded. "Good. Maybe you'll build something honest this time." He looked up at me, eyes glistening. "You already did." We sat in silence after that. Not as enemies, not even as lovers. Just as 2 people who'd shared a lifetime of lessons written in blood and signatures. When he finally stood, he said, "You were never my weakness, Ava. You were my consequence." And then he left. I watched him disappear into the crowd, another face swallowed by the city. For a moment, I felt an ache I couldn't name. Not love, not regret. Maybe grief for everything we might have been if pride hadn't poisoned us. Back at my office that evening, I opened his envelope. Inside were blueprints, early drafts of projects we'd once dreamed of together. There were handwritten notes in the margins. Ask Ava if this design makes sense. Ava's idea, open courtyard. I traced the ink with my fingers, realizing he'd never completely erased me, even when he'd tried. I locked the envelope in my desk drawer, not as a trophy but as a relic, proof that destruction can also birth creation. That night, I went home to an empty apartment. The penthouse felt different now, no longer a cage, but a monument to endurance. I poured myself a glass of wine, stepped out onto the balcony, and looked down at the city glowing beneath me. For years, I'd built my life on silence and calculation. But standing there, I realized the next chapter couldn't be written in whispers. It had to breathe. It had to live. The next morning, I drafted a letter to the Northbridge board. Effective immediately, I will be stepping down as CEO of Northbridge Urban. I will remain as chairwoman and advisor. My focus now will shift to education, to building spaces where future architects, designers, and leaders can learn what integrity truly means. When I sent it, I felt a strange lightness, the kind that comes not from winning, but from finishing something completely. Later that week, I visited the Veterans Housing Project again. The old man was there, sitting on the same bench, feeding pigeons. "Back to check on us, huh?" he said. I smiled. "Back to make sure it lasts." He nodded toward the building behind me. "It will. You built it with truth. That's stronger than steel." As I walked away, his words echoed in my mind. Stronger than steel. The city hummed around me, messy, alive, unapologetically imperfect. For the first time in a decade, I didn't feel the need to control it. Because control, I finally understood, had never been the goal. Peace was. And maybe, in its quiet, complicated way, I had found it. Winter descended on the city like a slow exhale, crisp, clean, and brutally honest. The leaves were gone, the skyline stripped bare, and every morning Central Park shimmered under a thin frost. It felt fitting. My life had been rebuilt, the noise quieted, but beneath that peace was the cold truth of what power costs. I spent my days teaching now guest lectures at Columbia, mentorship sessions with young architects and city planners. I talked less about profit and more about purpose. Buildings, I told them, are not just walls. They are reflections of the people who built them. If you cheat the process, the foundation remembers. Sometimes, the students would stare at me, too young to understand the weight behind those words. But that was fine. Lessons, like healing, need time to take root. Northbridge Urban thrived without me at the helm. New management embraced the transparency model I'd established: clean audits, ethical sourcing, community-first design. The company's new slogan, "Integrity is Architecture," started showing up on billboards and trade journals. People called it a revolution in development. I called it a correction. Still, some nights I found myself pacing the apartment, restless. Freedom was intoxicating, but it came with emptiness. For years, my life had revolved around one objective: dismantling Ethan's empire. Now that it was done, I had no enemy left, just silence. Until one evening, when a knock broke that silence. It was a courier plain envelope, no return address. I hesitated before opening it. Inside, there was a clipping from a Lisbon newspaper. The headline read, "American Architect Wins Green Design Award for Restoring Abandoned Village." Below it was a small photo: Ethan, standing beside a modest brick building, smiling faintly. He looked older, humbled, but alive in a way I'd never seen before. For a long time, I just stared at it. Then I laughed quietly, the sound surprising even me. "So you did build something honest," I murmured. The thought didn't hurt. In fact, it brought a strange warmth. Maybe, after all the destruction, we had both found redemption in creation. That night, I took out the envelope of his old blueprints, the ones he'd left me during our final meeting. I laid them on the table, tracing his handwriting again. It no longer felt like the relic of a past I wanted to bury. It felt like the closing of a circle. The next morning, I called the Foundation's board and proposed a new project, the Cole Reed Initiative, a program to fund sustainable architecture for women rebuilding their communities after financial or domestic collapse. There was silence on the call at first. The name startled them. "You're naming it after him?" someone asked. "I'm naming it after what we both survived," I said simply. "He built the lesson, I built the future." Within weeks, the program gained traction. Grants poured in. Architects from across the country volunteered. I traveled to small towns, sitting with women who'd lost everything: homes, families, dignity, and watched their eyes light up as they unrolled blueprints for a new start. Their stories reminded me of who I'd once been: afraid, diminished, desperate for control. I wanted to show them what I'd learned, that strength doesn't come from holding on. It comes from letting go and building again anyway. One afternoon in Detroit, during a site visit, a young woman named Lila approached me. She was 28, newly divorced, with 2 kids and a half-burned dream of opening a bakery in a converted warehouse. "I read your story," she said shyly, "about how you rebuilt after your husband took everything. How did you do it without hating him?" I thought for a long time before answering. "I didn't," I said softly. "I hated him for years. But one day, I realized hate is just a form of grief. Grief for the life we thought we'd have. When that grief runs out, what's left isn't forgiveness. It's freedom." She nodded slowly, tears welling up. "And what if I'm not there yet?" "Then start building anyway," I said. "Peace will find you in the process." When I returned to New York that evening, the city looked different. Not smaller, not colder, just quieter. Maybe it was me who had changed. The drive that once fueled every move of my life had transformed into something gentler, something less about power and more about presence. I began spending weekends at my father's house in Connecticut. He was older now, slower, but his mind was still razor sharp. We'd sit by the fireplace, sipping tea, watching the snow fall. "You've done well, Ava," he said one night. "Better than I ever did. You turned pain into structure." I smiled. "You taught me that revenge isn't the point. Precision is." He chuckled. "And yet, you found peace anyway. That's the part I never managed." We sat in silence for a while before he added, "When I'm gone, don't build monuments, build schools." I promised him I would. A few weeks later, the first Colereed Institute for Ethical Design opened in Brooklyn, a restored warehouse-turned-learning center. On the opening day, as students filled the halls, I stood at the entrance watching the light spill across the polished floors. The energy felt alive, full of possibility. One of the students, a young man with paint on his hands, approached me shyly. "Ma'am, is it true you used to run the biggest real estate firm in Manhattan?" I smiled. "Once," I said. "But the biggest isn't always the best. The strongest things are usually the ones that survive quietly." He tilted his head. "Then what are you building now?" "People," I said simply, "ones who won't make the same mistakes I did." All laugh. That evening, when the ceremony ended, I walked outside into the first snowfall of the year. Snowflakes melted on my palms, cold and fleeting reminders that even the softest things can change the shape of the world if they fall long enough. For a moment, I thought about Ethan again somewhere across the ocean, sketching lines on paper, maybe looking at the same kind of snow. I didn't miss him, but I hoped he was at peace. Because in his downfall, I'd found my clarity, and in my victory, I'd found humility. Looking up at the gray sky, I whispered, "We did build something honest after all." Then I turned toward the city, my city alive, flawed, and endlessly forgiving. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing anything. I was simply standing still, letting the world breathe with me. And that, I realized, was the true reward of surviving. Not the empire you build, but the silence you can finally live inside without fear. Spring returned with quiet grace, as if the city itself had exhaled after holding its breath through the long winter. The Hudson shimmered in pale gold at sunrise, and from the balcony of my apartment, I could see the skyline breathing again, cranes swinging, traffic pulsing, life moving forward. And so was I. The Colereed Initiative had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. Dozens of women-led reconstruction projects dotted the map's small towns in Ohio, coastal villages in the Philippines, rural communities in Kenya. Every blueprint carried one common line at the bottom corner: designed with resilience. But even success can feel hollow when it stops challenging you. I was still haunted by a quiet question: what comes after survival? One morning, I was invited to deliver the keynote speech at an international architecture summit in Kyoto. The theme, Rebuilding with Integrity. I hesitated before accepting. Japan was half a world away, yet somehow it felt close to the journey I'd taken, disciplined, deliberate, centered on rebuilding something broken with grace. When I arrived, cherry blossoms framed the city in soft pink. I walked through narrow streets where tradition coexisted with innovation, where shrines stood beside skyscrapers. It reminded me that beauty wasn't born from perfection, it was born from endurance. At the conference hall, hundreds of faces looked up at me. The host introduced me as the woman who turned betrayal into a blueprint. The audience applauded, but I didn't smile. That phrase had followed me for years, and I was ready to shed it. I began simply. Once I believed architecture was about design, I said. Then I thought it was about dominance. Today, I know it's about dignity, how we rebuild when no one's watching, and how we treat the foundations beneath us, human or concrete. I told them about Northbridge Urban, about the Cole Reed Initiative, about how power without integrity corrodes faster than steel. But I also told them about Ethan without bitterness, without pride. Sometimes, I said, it takes losing everything to see what was worth keeping. When I finished, the room was silent. Then, one by one, people stood not for spectacle, but for resonance. The applause didn't sound like noise. It sounded like acknowledgement. That evening, I wandered through a Kyoto garden alone. Lanterns floated on a pond, their reflections trembling on the water. A Japanese architect joined me, a soft-spoken man named Hiroshi. We talked about materials, legacy, and silence. Your story, he said, it's not about revenge, it's about reconstruction. I smiled. Maybe that's all life is, demolition and reconstruction, over and over again. He nodded. But only a few rebuild with grace. I mad. When I flew back to New York, I carried that sentence like a seed. Months passed. The Institute flourished. My father passed quietly in his sleep that summer, a book open on his chest. In his will, he left me a single line handwritten on paper. For once, Ava, stop building and start living. So I did. I sold the penthouse, the place where my silence had once been mistaken for weakness, and moved into a small brownstone near the river. I filled it with plants, books, and sunlight. Some mornings, I taught online. Other days, I volunteered at the Institute, walking through rooms filled with young voices sketching dreams. One afternoon, as I was leaving, a student handed me a letter. It came from Portugal, she said. I froze. Inside, there was a postcard of the restored village. Ethan had designed the one that had won the award. On the back, his handwriting was smaller, steadier than before. Ava, the school is finished. The children planted cherry trees outside. One of them asked me today if buildings can forgive. I told her they can if the people who build them learn to. I think I finally understand what you meant. I stood in the hallway, tears gathering before I could stop them. Not out of love, not even nostalgia, just release. Because forgiveness isn't a gift you give someone else. It's the final debt you clear with yourself. That night, I visited the riverfront where New York's lights shimmered like falling stars. The air smelled of rain and new beginnings. I thought about all the versions of myself I'd buried: the naive wife, the calculating strategist, the steel-hearted CEO, and I realized I didn't have to choose between them anymore. They had all built me. Somewhere I imagined Ethan walking along a different river, watching the same moon. Two architects of broken things, finally at peace with their ruins. The next morning, I returned to the Institute. A class was studying urban restoration models, and a young woman stood at the front, presenting a project that used recycled debris as building blocks for affordable housing. When she finished, I asked, "Why use something broken?" She smiled. "Because broken things already know how to survive." I felt my throat tighten. That was it, the truth I had spent a lifetime circling around. Later that evening, as I locked the Institute's doors, the city hummed softly beneath the sunset. Life rebuilt again. And I whispered to no one and everyone, "I forgive you. I forgive me." The wind carried the words away, scattering them like ash and seeds at once. Because some endings aren't destruction. They're foundations. A year passed, and the city had changed its rhythm again. spring returned to New York, tender and alive, yet quieter this time, as if even the wind had learned to whisper instead of roar. I woke up one morning to birdsong instead of alarms, to sunlight instead of the glow of a laptop screen. The war was long over, and so was the hunger that once defined me. I spent my mornings walking by the river, watching the tide move like time itself, steady, impartial, unstoppable. It struck me how similar water was to truth, patient enough to carve through stone, powerful enough to reshape entire landscapes. For years, I had fought to control the current. Now, I simply let it carry me. The Cole Reed Institute had grown into something I could never have envisioned. What began as a project of atonement had become a movement. Across continents, young architects were designing not for wealth, but for meaning. In Nairobi, a team built schools from recycled glass. In the Philippines, they raised stilt homes that could withstand floods. In Detroit, women turned abandoned factories into art studios and community kitchens. They sent me letters, photos, fragments of gratitude. I pinned them to a corkboard in my study, not as trophies, but as reminders that legacies are built not from power, but from participation. One afternoon, while sorting through the mail, I found another letter from Portugal. This one wasn't from Ethan, it was from a child, a student at his village school. The handwriting was clumsy, the English imperfect, but the message was pure. Dear Miss Ava, Mr. Ethan told us about your buildings. He said you make houses for people who lose everything. I want to be like you and him. I want to make buildings that feel like hugs. Thank you for teaching my teacher how to build again. I sat there for a long time, the letter trembling in my hands. Buildings that feel like hugs. Such an innocent phrase, and yet, in its simplicity, it captured everything I'd spent a lifetime chasing. To build something that didn't just protect, but embraced. To create structures that healed, not just impressed. That night, I stood by the window of my brownstone and looked across the city. For the first time, I didn't see competition, ambition, or ghosts. I saw possibility. The skyline no longer looked like power. It looked like connection steel and glass holding hands in the sky. I decided then to write a book not about business or betrayal or even architecture, but about the art of rebuilding. About what it means to lose and still choose to create. I called it Blueprints for the Soul. It took me 6 months to write. Each chapter was a confession of fear, of mistakes, of redemption. I didn't sanitize the pain. I let it breathe on the page. Because truth, when spoken softly, has a way of healing both speaker and listener. When the book was published, it wasn't a bestseller. It didn't need to be. But the letters that came afterward from widows, from single fathers, from survivors, told me it had reached exactly who it needed to. One evening, during a book signing event in Los Angeles, a woman approached me. She was maybe in her 50s, elegant but worn by life. She handed me a copy and said, "I read your book 3 times. It made me leave a man who'd been breaking me for 20 years. Her voice shook. I thought silence was strength, but now I know silence can also be surrender. I took her hand and said, "Silence is strength when it's chosen, not forced." She nodded, tears streaking her face. "Thank you for teaching me that." When she left, I sat in the quiet of the bookstore, surrounded by strangers reading my words, and felt something warm bloom in my chest. For the first time, I understood what my father had meant when he told me to stop building and start living. Because life, at its best, is not architecture. It's restoration. Weeks later, I returned to Lisbon for the first time. The small coastal village Ethan had rebuilt was exactly as I'd imagined. Simple, sunlit, honest. Children played near the water. The school's courtyard was filled with laughter. And beneath the cherry trees, there was a plaque that read, "To those who rebuild with truth, your work never ends." I stood there for a long time, my hand on the cool stone. Ethan was gone. They told me he'd passed months earlier, quietly, in his sleep. The villagers said he worked until the last day, sketching designs for a library by the sea. There were no tears this time, only stillness. Because I knew that death wasn't an ending for him or for us. It was just another reconstruction. The body fades, the work remains. As I walked toward the ocean, the sky painted itself in gold. I sat on a stone wall and watched the tide roll in, the water licking at the shore like a heartbeat. For a moment, I imagined him sitting beside me, sketchbook in hand, smiling that same half-smile he wore the first time we dreamed of building a world together. "I think we did it," I whispered to the wind. "We built something that lasted." And in the crash of waves, I thought I heard an answer. When I returned to New York, I left the letter from the Portuguese child framed on my desk. Every morning, it greeted me before I began my day. Sometimes, visitors would ask why I kept it there. I'd tell them the truth. "Because that letter," I'd say, "reminds me that everything we build, even from pain, can still become a home for someone else." And what? Years later, the skyline outside my window would continue to change. New towers rose, old ones fell. But one constant remained: the belief that strength is not in what we hold, but in what we're willing to let go of. In the end, the empire, the fortune, the revenge, none of it mattered. What endured was the legacy of rebuilding, the proof that from the ruins of betrayal, you can still create beauty. And as the evening light washed over the city I once fought to control, I closed my eyes and finally whispered the words I'd waited a lifetime to say: "I'm home."